Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum to anyone who may be tuning into this short video, and hello also to anyone who may be listening. This is part 2 of a series that I do hope to load up entitled Embarking on Your Spiritual Path. And why I am doing this short series is because, as I said in the last video, when you go on YouTube and you key in the words spirituality or spiritual path, mainly the videos that come up are presented by people from the Hindu and Buddhist cultures, very often Western people who have extracted certain teachings from the Buddhist and Hindu traditions and that have adapted them to a Western secular environment and practice and culture. And often people from within the classical Hindu or Buddhist traditions themselves will argue that this is something that people in the Western secular cultures tend to do. They tend to borrow certain practices or forms of thought from religions that they feel are attractive, and they adapt them to their own context. I would argue that actually we need to take a critical approach, or we could say a more critical approach, of how Western secular culture has cultivated our personalities, our way of thinking and our way of being, and how this is getting imposed or impressed upon the rest of the world. The rest of the world feels compelled to comply with a certain way of thinking and being that has been cultivated by the secular West, at least for the last 100 years. Somebody did comment that in Muslim countries, people can be just as hedonistic or despotic as anybody from a Western country. And I would argue absolutely. This is not to do with particular individuals or personalities who are hedonistic and even secular. We find in the time of the Holy Prophet himself, and even after the assassination of Ali ibn Abi Talib, peace be upon him, the Holy Prophet's cousin and successor, after his assassination, we could say that Islam was appropriated by a secular tribe, a secular clan, the Bani Umayyah, and it was turned into a hedonistic and despotic force in the society. So this is not particularly about, this isn't an argument about the terrible West and the perfect East. What I'm talking about is the teachings of the Holy Prophet and his family that have been transmitted, that are a benefit for all of us, and that can provide some kind of sanity in a world where our thinking is being molded mainly for economic purposes and also for the purposes of control. And so in the last video, I was talking about why somebody from the West would be interested in coming into Islam, particularly as it does have quite strict rules on morality and behavior in society. And I would argue that, okay, other countries may, yes, be hedonistic, they may have loose morals, there may be crimes being committed, but we could say that in the case of Western countries, Europe and United States, entire traditions have been abandoned. We can see this happening in Turkey as well, with Ataturk, when he started to change Turkish script from the cursive script, or the cursive Arabic derived script, into the European script. I have spoken to Muslims from Azerbaijan, where Russia has been predominant over the last few decades, and they are also no longer able to access texts from their own Islamic tradition because they can no longer read those texts. We find the same happening in the Arab world, where Arab youth value the learning of English over the learning of Arabic, and again therefore can no longer access the texts of their own tradition. And the same is happening in India as well. People's knowledge of Urdu is in decline, and so they are not able to access the texts of their tradition. And so overall, the mentality, the way of thinking that has been cultivated among youth in European and American cultures, this force that has changed the way of thinking in the youth is also being imposed or encouraged in the youth of non-Western countries, particularly through the education systems. So again, I would argue that if we are to embark on a spiritual path, we first of all need to take a critical approach to how we are thinking already. It's not really enough to go from your own highly secularized, highly capitalistic, highly materialistic society, which nevertheless may contain very good people who work for charities and have the best of intentions, but it's not enough to go from that environment and to go out and try to seek some kind of ecstatic form of enlightenment. Most of the time we see people, when they're looking for enlightenment or they're looking for some kind of spiritual component in their life, they're looking for this bliss. They're looking for perhaps the experience of love for the divine and the divine's love for them. So to take the Islamic context, when people want to embark on this spiritual path in Islam, they may start to pick up certain books that teach about the journey of the soul from its entrapment in the material world and its progressive movement towards the divine light, we could even say. But as we know, reading those books is not enough. And I would argue that those books also don't really give enough detail on the practicalities of what embarking on a spiritual path entails. And of course, especially in the kind of climate that we are living in today. These texts do give quite a good psychological analysis or some kind of guidance on how to analyze yourself psychologically, but very often they are taken out of their social and political context. And this is one other point that I want to talk, inshallah, about at some point, which is the political and social context of the emergence of various spiritual traditions. Because very often you find that spiritual paths and spiritual teachings are not untainted by politics, and they're not untainted by their social and historical context. Of course, we all want something that is ideal, something that is beautiful, something that is infallible, something that is not touched by the pollution of this world. But if we are not going to be deluded by this idea of an untainted tradition, then we need again to take a critical look at the traditions that we are taking on and embarking on. So I'm just going to conclude this short talk on embarking on your spiritual path with this small point that when you do pick up these books on the journey of the soul and the methods for embarking on this journey towards the divine, bear in mind that one needs to take quite a hard critical look, number one, at one's own context, at one's own way of thinking, at one's own way of being, and to be aware of how social and political and economic forces have influenced our way of thinking and way of being, and how those actually may be holding us back from being aware of what is the real and what is the true path. Secondly, when we do become engrossed in certain texts, or maybe even certain practices that those texts recommend, it is worth bearing in mind that these texts may not be able to sustain you for some of the real difficult challenges that you're going to face in life, and some of the real darknesses that you may be confronted with. So inshallah, in the next video I want to talk about confronting the darkness, confronting darknesses with which we are faced in our lives and in this world today. So thank you for listening, and inshallah I will see you in the next video. Assalamu alaikum.